if the license is approved, it would be a, quote, new and unique benchmark for trust in the stablecoin market, as the company would be under federal and state oversight.
There's a strange feeling that hits after watching the XRP video we just watched. Not excitement, not fear. More like, wait, did I hear that right? Because when you hear a number like $13 trillion per day, your brain wants to reject it immediately. It sounds exaggerated, unreal, like something meant to trigger clicks, not understanding. And that instinct is healthy. But here's the uncomfortable part. What if the number isn't the point? What if the number is just a side effect of something much bigger quietly taking shape? Right now, a lot of people are asking the same question in different ways. Is it true that XRP and HBAR are connected to flows that large? Is this real utility? Or just another narrative stretched too far? And if there really is that much value moving through global systems every day, where do these networks actually
fit? There's Algo up 76%, Ripple up 55%. Here's Ethereum 36%. And this is the intraday chart of Ethereum. Let me go to let's do year to date right there. And you can see it.
Fit. Those are the right questions. Because the answer isn't simple and it's definitely not hype. Let's slow this down. When people hear $13 trillion per day, they imagine crypto volume, trading, speculation, charts moving back and forth. That's not what this is about. That number comes from global payment and settlement systems, the invisible plumbing of finance, the part of the world economy that moves money between banks, institutions, clearinghouses, and governments before anyone ever sees it. Foreign exchange settlement, interbank transfers, securities settlement, liquidity provisioning. Most of that value never touches retail-facing systems. It moves behind the scenes quietly, efficiently, and with extreme sensitivity to risk. This is where the conversation around XRP and HBAR actually belongs. Not in price predictions, not in social media hype, but in infrastructure conversations. XRP was designed from the beginning to address a very specific problem. How do you move value across borders instantly without forcing institutions to pre-fund accounts all over the world? That problem still exists, and it exists at a scale that feels almost uncomfortable to think about. HBAR, on the other hand, was built with a different but complementary focus: trust at scale, governance, predictability, systems that enterprises and regulators can actually rely on without chaos. Different designs, different strengths, but aimed at the same layer of the financial stack, the layer where failure isn't allowed. Now here's where people get misled. No one is saying XRP or HBAR are processing $13 trillion per day right now. That's not the claim. The real claim is more subtle and more important, that these networks are being positioned for markets where those kinds of flows already exist. That's a completely different statement. It's not about replacing the entire system overnight. It's about becoming part of it. Even a small percentage of those flows creates pressure that crypto markets are not emotionally prepared for. And this is where the deception happens. People look at current prices and assume irrelevance. But price doesn't reflect potential flow. Price reflects current demand. Infrastructure adoption doesn't show up as demand at first. It shows up as testing, pilots, integration discussions, quiet alignment. That phase feels boring. And boring is exactly what institutions want. If XRP or HBAR were volatile, chaotic, or emotionally driven, they wouldn't even be considered for serious financial plumbing. Stability is the audition. Silence is part of the process. Here's the part that really messes with perception. The larger the system you're trying to serve, the less visible your progress looks at the beginning. When retail adoption happens, you see it immediately. When infrastructure adoption happens, you don't see it at all. Until it's done. So when people throw around big numbers, the mistake isn't that the numbers are fake. The mistake is thinking those numbers imply instant price movement. They don't. They imply selection pressure. They imply that certain networks are being evaluated not as investments, but as tools. And tools don't get repriced emotionally. They get repriced when the system depends on them. That's why this conversation feels so uncomfortable. Because if even a fraction of global settlement volume ever relies on crypto rails, the current market framework doesn't apply anymore. Not because of hype, because of necessity. And necessity is what forces repricing that doesn't easily reverse. Right now, XRP and HBAR are sitting in that uncomfortable middle zone. Too boring for hype-driven traders. Too important to ignore at the infrastructure level. That's why the question, is this true, matters so much. Not because of the number itself, but because of what happens if the system quietly answers yes behind the scenes, long before price reflects it. In the next section, we're going to break this down properly. Where the 13 trillion per day idea actually comes from, what role bridge assets realistically play in those flows, and why most people misunderstand how infrastructure adoption translates into market value. Not speculation, not promises, just how the system actually moves. Because once you see that clearly, the price conversation changes completely. So let's talk about where that $13 trillion per day idea actually comes from. Because this is where most people get confused. That number doesn't come from crypto. It comes from traditional finance. Specifically, global settlement and foreign exchange markets, interbank transfers, securities clearing, cross-border liquidity flows that happen every single day, whether markets are bullish, bearish, or completely asleep. These systems already move enormous value. They always have. What's changing is how that value moves. Right now, much of the global financial system is still built on slow, fragmented, and expensive rails. Money gets locked up in pre-funded accounts. Settlement takes days. Liquidity is inefficiently distributed across borders. This isn't a theory. It's a known problem. And solving that problem is where assets like XRP and HBAR enter the conversation. Not as replacements for the entire system, but as upgrades to specific pain points. XRP's original thesis was simple but powerful. Instead of parking capital everywhere in advance, what if institutions could source liquidity on demand, instantly, across borders? That idea alone targets a market so large it's hard to emotionally process. Because foreign exchange settlement isn't about speculation. It's about necessity. Banks must move money daily to function. HBAR approaches the same layer from a different angle. It's not focused on liquidity itself, but on trust, governance, and operational certainty. In other words, can you run a financial process on this network without worrying about forks, downtime, or unpredictable behavior? Those questions matter far more than transaction speed when institutions are involved. Now here's where the misunderstanding starts. When people hear these use cases, they immediately jump to price. If this is real, why hasn't price already moved? But that question assumes markets price potential instantly. They don't. Markets price confirm demand. And infrastructure demand doesn't appear as buying pressure until much later. First comes evaluation, then limited testing, then constrained use, then expansion, then dependency. Only after dependency forms does price respond in a way that feels dramatic. That entire process can take years. And during those years, price can look completely disconnected from reality. That doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means you're early enough that the system hasn't committed yet. Think of it this way. If a bank is testing a new settlement rail, it doesn't announce it on social media. It doesn't buy tokens aggressively on open markets. It tests in controlled environments, often with minimal volume. The goal isn't to move markets. The goal is to answer one question. Can we trust this? That's why the 13 trillion per day idea is so often misused. It's not saying XRP or HBAR are handling that volume today. It's saying the markets they are aiming at already move that kind of value. And even a tiny slice of those flows changes the equation. But here's the part people really don't like hearing. Just because a network can serve that market doesn't mean it will capture it. Selection is competitive. Institutions evaluate multiple options. They compare costs, risk, governance, and long-term stability. This is where XRP and HBAR stand out, not because they're perfect, but because they were designed with these constraints in mind from the beginning. Predictable fees, deterministic finality, clear governance structures, regulatory-friendly design choices. These aren't exciting features. They're necessary ones. Now let's address the emotional elephant in the room. If these assets are really positioned for something this big, why does it feel like nothing is happening? Because markets are not forward-looking in the way people think. They're reactive. They wait for confirmation. And confirmation only comes once systems are already relying on something. By the time price reflects infrastructure adoption, the opportunity to position calmly is usually gone. That's why this phase feels deceptive. You're being asked to trust signals that don't give you emotional feedback. No dopamine, no excitement, no validation, just quiet alignment. And that's why most people will miss it. They'll dismiss the entire idea as exaggeration, not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't fit the way speculative markets usually behave. But infrastructure has never behaved like speculation. It moves slowly. It locks in quietly. And when it finally shows up in price, it doesn't ask for permission. So is it true that XRP and HBAR are connected to $13 trillion per day? Not in the way social media implies. They're connected to systems where that scale already exists. That's the truth most people don't slow down enough to understand. And once you understand that difference, the entire conversation shifts. Because the question stops being, is this hype? And becomes, what happens if even a fraction of this system migrates? That's what we're going to explore next. Next, we'll talk about how infrastructure adoption actually turns into repricing, why it often feels sudden, and what signals tell you the shift from testing to dependency is getting close. Because when that line is crossed, the market doesn't move emotionally. It moves structurally. And that's a very different kind of breakout. At some point, the conversation stops being about possibility and starts being about transition. That's the moment most people don't recognize until it's already passed. Because infrastructure adoption doesn't announce itself with excitement. It announces itself with silence, with systems behaving differently before anyone explains why. This is where XRP and HBAR quietly move from being interesting ideas to becoming parts of a process. And processes don't care about sentiment. They care about reliability. Here's what actually happens when large financial systems consider new rails. They don't flip a switch. They segment. They test in isolated environments. They limit exposure. They simulate stress. They measure failure points. None of this shows up on a chart. None of it creates social media narratives. But every step increases one thing that matters more than anything else. Confidence. Confidence that the system works under pressure. Confidence that governance holds when something goes wrong. Confidence that regulators won't be blindsided by design choices. This is where BAR's design becomes quietly powerful. Predictable fees. Deterministic finality. Known governance participants. These aren't flashy features, but they remove uncertainty. And uncertainty is what institutions fear most. XRP approaches confidence from a different angle. Liquidity efficiency. If you can reduce the amount of capital locked up globally just to move money, you're not creating convenience. You're freeing balance sheets. That's not optional value. That's structural value. Now here's the important shift. When testing turns into limited production use, the system's behavior changes. Failures become expensive. Downtime becomes unacceptable. Alternatives become risk. At that point, the asset or network isn't being evaluated anymore. It's being depended on. And dependence is where repricing begins, not emotionally but mechanically. The market doesn't reprice because of belief. It reprices because demand becomes non-negotiable. But that demand doesn't always show up as obvious buying pressure at first. Why? Because institutions don't source exposure the way retail does. They don't chase spot markets aggressively. They hedge. They structure. They minimize visibility. Price can remain subdued even as usage grows. This is another reason people feel deceived. They assume demand must equal price movement. That's only true in speculative markets. Infrastructure demand behaves differently. It accumulates quietly until liquidity becomes tight. Then price adjusts quickly, often violently, because the market wasn't prepared. This is why infrastructure-driven moves feel sudden. They're not sudden. They're unobserved. By the time price reacts, the decision has already been made at the system level. This is the part most people struggle with emotionally. You're being asked to hold a thesis that doesn't reward you with feedback. No excitement, no clear confirmation, just time. And time is uncomfortable in markets built on speed. But ask yourself this. If XRP or HBAR were already repriced for global settlement relevance, would institutions still see opportunity? Probably not. High volatility equals high risk. Low visibility equals optionality. Right now, optionality still exists. And optionality is where positioning lives. The 13 trillion per day number only matters in one way. It tells you the scale of the system being targeted. Even marginal penetration into that system dwarfs retail speculation. But marginal penetration requires trust. And trust is slow. The market's biggest mistake is assuming speed equals inevitability. In infrastructure, stability equals inevitability. That's what XRP and HBAR are optimizing for. Not attention, not narratives, but survivability under pressure. Here's the clearest signal to watch for. Not price, not headlines, but behavior. Does price stop reacting to negative news? Do pullbacks become shallow? Does volume quietly increase without excitement? Those are signs of structural accumulation. They don't feel bullish. They feel boring. Until suddenly they don't. And this is why most people miss the move. They wait for certainty. But certainty is expensive. The market charges a premium for it. Right now, the cost of positioning is emotional discomfort. Later, the cost will be financial. That's the trade-off. So when people ask, is this really true about XRP and HBAR? The honest answer is this. The possibility is real. The process is real. The timeline is uncertain. And price will only respond once dependency removes alternatives. That's how infrastructure always reprices. Slowly at first, then all at once. What preparation actually looks like from here. How to stay clear-headed as narratives intensify. And how to avoid the most common mistake people make right before infrastructure adoption becomes visible. Because the hardest part isn't understanding the thesis. It's staying aligned long enough to benefit when the system finishes deciding. So now we're at the part most people skip. Not the prediction, not the price target, the preparation. Because once you understand how infrastructure adoption actually works, you realize something uncomfortable. There is no dramatic signal that tells you, now it's safe. There's just a quiet moment where the system has mostly decided, and the market hasn't caught up yet. That's where XRP and HBAR are sitting. Not because they're guaranteed winners, but because they're being evaluated in arenas where scale already exists. And that changes how you should think about them. Preparation right now doesn't mean doing more. It means doing less, but with clarity. Less reacting to noise. Less chasing narratives. Less emotional decision-making. More observation. More patience. More alignment with how systems actually choose tools. If even a fraction of global settlement flows ever relies on crypto rails, the current market framework won't apply anymore. Not overnight. Not explosively, but decisively. And that's the kind of shift you don't trade in and out of. You position for it. The mistake most people make at this stage is waiting for validation. They want price to move first. They want headlines to confirm the story. They want social consensus. But by the time all of that shows up, the opportunity to position calmly is gone. The market doesn't reward those who wait for certainty. It rewards those who understand process. Right now, the cost of positioning is emotional. You have to sit with doubt, with boredom, with the feeling that nothing is happening. Later, the cost will be financial. Because once dependency forms, price doesn't negotiate. It adjusts. This doesn't mean you ignore risk. It means you understand it correctly. Infrastructure adoption is slow, selective, and unforgiving. But when it locks in, it doesn't reverse easily. That's why this conversation matters. Not because of a number like $13 trillion per day, but because of what happens when systems start relying on tools instead of speculating on ideas. If this video helped you see XRP and HBAR through a clearer lens, take a second and like it. It tells me you want more signal and less noise. Subscribe if you haven't already. This channel isn't about hype cycles. It's about understanding where the system is quietly moving before price reacts. And let me know in the comments, do you think the market is still underestimating infrastructure assets like XRP and HBAR? Or do you feel the shift starting to form? I read every comment, because the real edge isn't predicting the next move. It's recognizing when the system has already started moving and staying positioned long enough to let the market catch up.